Welcome, everyone, to this briefing brought to you by the Israel Defense and Security Forum, IDSF. In Hebrew, name is Bitronistim. IDSF is the leading Israeli organization advocating for strong national security to defend Israel. Thank you, of course, to all of our viewers and supporters for tuning into this briefing. I'm joined by the one and only Danny Seaman today to share a little bit about what is happening in Israel. Danny, thank you so much for joining.
As always, my pleasure. Thank you.
Danny, I have to tell you, on my most recent trip to the US, going from city to city, there were really two questions that people would ask me. Question number one is, tell us the latest on what's happening in Israel. And question number two is, when is Danny coming back on the briefing? So it's always great to have you. Danny, let me start off with something that very much speaks to your expertise in representing Israel in the foreign media. As operations in Gaza slow down, and now we're hearing more of these targeted killings of senior leaders, they're becoming more prevalent. It seems that the international media is less hostile to Israel. There's less talk about the humanitarian crisis. I'm curious to know if you agree with that sentiment, or you think, no, it's just as bad as it has been since the beginning of the war.
Don't let the media trick you into believing and fool you into thinking that they've changed in any way. All I have to do is address, it's already less than a week. So much has happened over this week that a year of events happened within a week. It was just last week. We were discussing, all of us, I'm sure, on the panel as well, Bibi's speech in Congress, and last Thursday was about to meet with the president and waiting to meet with Trump and everything. And look what we've gone through, the 12 children that were killed last week, over the weekend. And since then, all these occurrences, and now we're in a situation where we're waiting to see what's going to happen next. But going back to the events of the last week, you had the murder of these 12 Israeli kids. And you would expect that media outlets would address the issue of murder of children, since they, over the months, one of the things they focused on so much was how children are affected in Gaza, which is legitimate, put children outside of the political equation. But here, even when we're not even talking about Jewish children, because they were very clear to stress the fact, more than what happened in the attack, was that this is occupied by Israel, in an area that was occupied by Israel. But even before they got to that point, it was Israel retaliates, and Israel strikes Lebanon, or Israel does this, or Israel does that. And that just goes to show you, I know the Washington Post later came out and apologized, but since they've only been covering the Middle East here for about a week or so, then we can expect them to make mistakes. Come on, I'm being very facetious and very cynical about this. They've been covering this for over 30, 40 years now. They know what's going on. They know what what is happening. They follow what is happening. So there's nothing innocent about what they're doing. And yes, they have a problem, a political problem, because Israel does not fit in to where their vision of the world. And it's not suddenly that we're the darlings, because the other thing that affects the media, besides their personal politics, they need to sell. And they need to concentrate on what their readers or their viewers are interested in. And what can you do? The situation here has become a bit boring. They can't continue. How often can they say, oh, the poor Palestinians in Gaza, and there's a crisis, and Israel's not letting this or that in? You can just do this story so many times. Now, I know that when we're talking about Jews, it's beyond the normal, because when it has to do with Jews, like I always said, Jews is news and Israel is interesting, but even that has an end to where they can extend it. So we've reached this point where it's just redundant. So we did the past 24 hours, you had these, and now in the next 48 hours, to 72 hours, I assume we're going to be encountering it over the weekend. I'll be surprised if it happens before, but they'll have new things to concentrate on. And of course, if Israel does respond or initiate or something, we'll be back in the news. Don't worry. So no, there's not been a change. It's just the circumstances and the way, the natural procession of the media and how it covers things.
Okay, maybe we'll circle back to that in a few minutes, but another super important question. Do you think that Israel wants to be drawn into a war? We're already in a war, so I should rephrase
Exactly.
it. Do you think Israel wants to be drawn into a much greater escalation with Hezbollah and Iran and is almost inviting that to happen?
Well, I'll start with taking the bigger picture and coming back down to where we are at the moment. The bigger picture is that for over 20 some years, nearly between 20 to 30 years already, we knew that we're coming to a point that we're going to have to address the issue of Iran. And it's been delayed every so often, but over, I think it was nearly 15, maybe 20 years ago, Israel had planned, at least under the first Netanyahu administration, they did a plan to take out the nuclear facilities in Iran, and it didn't happen for different reasons. But we knew this was coming up. Now, for too long, there were people ridiculing this. When Netanyahu went to speak in Congress a few years back, when he addressed the issue of the Iranian threat, people were saying, oh, he's constantly pointing the finger to Iran. I think everybody understands now two things, that the threat is real, and we can't delay this anymore. If you look at the circumstances with Gaza, in the past 20 years with the Gaza Strip, every year and a half to 2 years, we had another round of violence. And during those times, the Israeli public, especially those in the south of Israel, were saying to the government, finish this. We don't want to continue living like that, but for being under attack. And so we have to finish this for once and for all. And we went through 17 different campaigns until the last one that we're in now. And so we're already in it. We're in our worst case scenario as far as being in a battle. Many Israelis are called up in reserves. Our economy is holding in there strong, but it's already war-oriented. The circumstances, the international circumstances of Israel being under pressure, being criticized. Notice, by the way, in the past 24, 48 hours, there has not been criticism by Western governments. The United Nations, the United States stood up and very strongly behind Israel. The administration right now at the moment is being very clear about its support for the state of Israel. So it seems like everything is going, whether we want to be drawn into it or not. I think there's a realization here. And part of the reason that Netanyahu came to Congress last week was exactly for that, to make it clear to everybody. This conflict between Israel and Iran that we always saw in the future is now. And that's where we're at the moment, and this has to be addressed. And when we took out Hania the other day in Iran, sending them a clear message that this is it. It's a whole new ball game now, and we're ready for what we've been planning for years, what they have been planning for years, and we might as well not wait for it to be the right time for them. Because if it is anything now, it's the right time for us.
Okay, and now talking about the right time for us, obviously in the US with the election cycle, that certainly plays into the extent to which the US supports or openly promotes an escalation. But I'm curious to know what you think about the internal politics here in Israel, because it's not hard to turn on the news and to hear some commentator, whether it's here in Israel or abroad, talk about how there's an agenda in this war that's being driven by political aspirations or internal politics here within Israel. And a lot of these decisions are not being made about what's important in the war, but rather what's important in people's political careers. I'm curious your thoughts on that issue.
Can I say bullshit? Or is that a word we don't use in these briefings? But that's the only word that is appropriate here. This is something that has been, at least Netanyahu has been accused of for years. He is the kind of leader that rises to the occasion. And he understands exactly what the circumstances are at the moment. And everything rests on his shoulders. I think we're very fortunate that we have him in that position, because he's one of the few leaders, if at all, in Israel at this moment, that understands the historical, not only perspective, but also the consequences of what could happen and he's able to maintain that. Anything you hear about him doing this, these are the same things that have been thrown at him for years and years and years. But let's be honest. First off, every politician thinks about their own career. They wouldn't be politicians otherwise. You know, I once considered running for politics within the Likud, so I'm not. I'm a bit biased towards Netanyahu in that case, so I'm not hiding that. But after a while, I realized I'm not a politician. I'm not there for myself. I can't be that focused upon myself. I work with politicians. I saw how they are. I do think that many of the politicians in Israel have risen to the occasion right now, understanding where we're at and trying to conduct themselves in a profession, not only a professional, but a responsible manner. But I'll tell you why that is happening, because they realize that a majority of Israelis, whether from the right wing or the left wing, a majority of responsible Israelis understand what the circumstances are, what we're in at the moment, and it requires of all of us. And there are those forces who are not, who do not realize what is happening, are taking full advantage of the circumstances for their own political gains, and therefore they're reflecting their own kind of behavior and their way of thinking onto their adversaries. But fortunately, the public in Israel, and it starts with the soldiers, and the soldiers in the battlefield, reservists, I'm not even talking about, you know what, I won't even talk about those in their mandatory service. Reservists are coming from home with their personal feelings and attitudes. It's not that they stop there and they're right wing, so I can go in and anybody, no, right wing, left wing, religious, non-religious, they're all fighting shoulder to shoulder. And there's been campaigns here initiated by the soldiers themselves, telling the politicians and telling the public who are engaged in political activity, literally, the campaign was, shut up, stop it, because this doesn't contribute, this bickering between us here, these kind of things. So most of the public agree with that sentiment and are upholding it. There are those elements who are not. What you're hearing abroad, unfortunately, is the expression of one political, the one political camp, which is not showing itself as being responsible. They, in a sense, have kidnapped the whole issue of the Israeli hostages and have taken it and have used it, not all of them, but have used the concept for their own political interests. Luckily, the majority of the public are not being drawn into an argument on that. They understand and respect even those families who have family members who are being held hostage and are being very open about and they're critical about the government. The public doesn't argue with them. The only time it did happen was last week when Netanyahu went to the States and Noah Argamani, who was just released, and she was a hostage because she came to the United States with the prime minister. And there could be no more important role for her than to come. And since she was such a symbol of the Israeli hostages, for the Americans to have the opportunity to see her in person and hear her in person. And yet there were those people here in Israel who found it necessary to even say, oh, she was kidnapped by Netanyahu, who took her. So the Israelis weren't drawn into that, and a lot of people shut them down, those who were making those kind of comments. And this was not by this extreme element. These were some of the leading members of the campaign that's been going on now for 2 years against this current government. But what happens is that this is vocalized by the media here, who are in line with that and opposed to the current right-wing government in Israel. And you hear a lot of that in the media coverage in the United States, because as I've mentioned in briefings that I've given before, that how the foreign media in Israel are influenced foremost by Haaretz newspaper, and we know where Haaretz stands, and by the voices of the left-wing Israelis. And even more than that, one of the leading voices today, you'll find them being interviewed on CNN and on the New York Times, is Barak Ravid, who used to work not only for Haaretz, but is very left-wing. And unfortunately, there are members of this administration that goes back 20 years. I don't know if any of you have know. This week, there was this interview with the former U.S. ambassador, the Biden ambassador to Israel, was very honest about how the administration was involving itself in different elements and aspects of Israeli life here, which is totally unacceptable, but he didn't even hide it. So you're having that being posted, and it's not reflective of what the true sentiment in Israel is. And again, it's not that people are all right-wing and then for Ben-Gvir or Netanyahu. No, the public here understand what the circumstances are and understand that we have to be unified and united in order to destroy our enemies, and don't let anything else. Don't just ignore what you're hearing on the media. You're getting facts from places like the IDSF and other influencers who are giving you what the Israeli sentiment among the average Israeli is, and that is unity, regardless of our differences. We'll deal with the politics when the war is over.
Danny, thank you for expressing that so eloquently. You know, it's interesting that when you live in Israel, you get your news not just from the media, but from people you see in the neighborhood, in the community, and you get a sense of what people think. Whereas when you live in the States, when you live abroad, you're really so much more dependent on the media. You don't get the feeling on the ground, and therefore you kind of buy into that narrative. So let me ask you a question, Danny. You know, with regards to the war in Gaza, it's kind of connected to people's political beliefs about Oslo, about what Israel should do the day after, about the general status of Arabs in Israel. Whereas when it comes to Hezbollah and Iran, almost none of those issues apply. So I'm curious to know, in your experience here in Israel, dealing with politicians, dealing with media, do they make a distinction between how they address Gaza and Hamas versus Hezbollah and Iran?
I would say Gaza, but Hamas is in the same category as Hezbollah and Iran. Even the Palestinian Authority today is more in line among the majority of Israelis, and that's why when you talk about there's no or little talk about the day after here, because you don't know what the circumstances are going to be. I do know one thing, just from what we're seeing coming out of Gaza. They have nowhere, or at least a majority of them, an absolute majority of the Gazans have nowhere to go back to. And already many of them are leaving. So there's going to be tremendous changes that we cannot address under the current circumstances, because the current circumstances are no longer valid, meaning the circumstances the people are trying to address in this is the way things were on the 6th of October. We're no longer on the circumstances of the 6th of October, not physically on the ground in Gaza, and certainly not ideologically, in the sense of most Israelis, as far as they're concerned, the two-state solution is over. It's over, because we cannot allow to have the threat. And just today, in the beginning, they thought there was a penetration in the north into Israel from the north of Samaria. They thought it was terrorists. It ended up being Arabs who wanted to come in to work in Israel. But that concern exists among the communities that are along the what was historically called the Green Line, where the barrier lies between Israel and the same barrier that was put up 20 years ago because of the terrorism and the fact that they crossed over easily into Israel. But at that time, we had the barrier. We thought that would provide us with security and somehow we can reach some kind of resolution. That's over. The PLO, as far as Israelis concerned, are no different, and they make it very clear themselves. To them, most of the Palestinians in Judea and Samaria, the Arabs in Judea and Samaria, support what Hamas did. And so Israelis support what we did, meaning defending ourselves, and therefore we're not going to make it easier for them. So that's why I'm saying anybody trying to discuss the day after is talking about something that we don't know, and it has nothing to do, no basis in reality at the moment. And anybody promoting that right now is doing it for political reasons. Beyond that, when it comes to Hezbollah and Iran, that's a whole different issue, because Iran, who is behind all of this, it's not only a threat to Israel, and I have to stress this. Yesterday, was the day before yesterday, already, they had the inauguration of their new president. And the their cheering when he was sworn in was Marg Marg Amrika. Marg in Persian, and I happen to know Persian because my family are Afghani and they spoke Persian. So Marg I know to be death. And you all have heard this over the years. Marg Marg Amrika, Marg Marg Israel. And they're calling death to America, death to Israel. And we're the little Satan. And that has meaning in their communities, because the big Satan is the United States. But the United States, not as a country, but what it represents. And it represents Western ideology and the West compared to the extreme Islam. And therefore, they are a threat to the Western world. And I don't have to just listen to the speech that Netanyahu gave last week in Congress, because he was addressing that and raising that point. It was understood by the United States, understood by the administration, understood by the American allies in Europe. And I say American allies in Europe because many of them are not allies of Israel at the moment, including NATO, who have Turkey as a member of NATO, who have been threatening Israel, and not in the NATO countries. And even the United States haven't said a word about a NATO member threatening an ally of the United States, but that's a whole different issue. But here we have those issues happening, and therefore we're going to have to address the threat by Iran. It'll probably happen in the upcoming days. Who knows what's going to happen afterwards? Who knows what the world situation may be? I'll take even a broader picture of things and just remind you, history does not repeat itself in precision, meaning things do not happen the same way. But there are events and occurrences that repeat themselves. Before, everybody remembers September 1st, 1939 is the beginning of World War II. But what led us to that point was not only the rise of the Nazis, but they invaded Alsace-Lorraine, and then they invaded Czechoslovakia, and then the Italians invaded, who were allies of the Nazis, invaded Ethiopia. And then there was the invasion of the Spanish Civil War. And then the Japanese were doing things in the Far East. So there were a lot of things happening around the world, which led to the eruption of a world war. We have to be smart enough, and here our listeners, the Americans, have to demand this of your administrations and your politicians, that make sure that we don't go down this slope towards a world war. We can stop it now. We can stop it now if we stand up to the forces. Israel is already in that battlefield. Let's make sure that they're not encouraged. And I'm talking about China, Russia, and Iran, who are all allied together, very similar to the alliances you had by the Axis countries before World War II. Let's learn history and realize that these patterns exist.
Danny, I thank you for all of these, all of this wisdom, all of these explanations for what's going on, and a big thank you to all of our viewers who are sending in the questions now during the briefing or prior. Danny, a lot of people would argue that the more of an aggressive posture that Israel takes, the less chance there is for peace. You seem to be saying the exact opposite. Can you please explain that?
Well, unfortunately, it's been proven again and again that peace does not come by two opposing entities when one of them does not uphold the same principles and values as the other. And Western society has been able to, following the World War, but again, the World War, the Second World War especially, did not happen because modern democracies and liberal countries went to war against each other. No, you had dictatorships were either by Marxist and nationalist movements, sentiments and ideologies, took on the Judeo-Christian entities and the values of Western civilization. And we have to be very clear about this. All the liberal principles of Western civilization are rooted in the Judeo-Christian heritage and the religious beliefs. So we can work out our differences and find resolution to it. But when you're dealing with countries, and I'm not even talking right now with the Russia, because you can resolve that in a way. But you have China and you have Iran, and both of these countries in no way share those same values, and therefore you have to stand up to it. I'm not saying go to war, but if they sense weakness, and if they sense that they can can advance their interests, they'll do it. China, for example, they have a stake standing right in front of their hungry teeth right now, which is Taiwan. They will, if they sense that the United States is weak, if they see that Israel is limited, I'm not going to say defeated, but is limited in its abilities, it's going to encourage them to take action as well. So that's where we're at this moment. And we have to understand that the peace will eventually happen, because you do have, Germany had become part of the Western world. Japan is one of the leading countries for many years of the Western democracies, because they were soundly defeated and they understood that their extreme policies are unacceptable. We paid a high price for it, but the price otherwise would have been being under these regimes, and we can't afford to do that. It is unacceptable. So I think we're at a stage where we can still stop it at its roots and not let it expand beyond there. But we have to be resilient, and we have to be aware, and we have to be willing. And at least here, the Israeli public has showed it over the past year, because we saw what will happen if we're not resilient and standing up to evil.
Danny, Seaman, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a pleasure as always. Thank you to all of the viewers and supporters for tuning in as we go into this tense weekend here in Israel. We pray that it'll be quiet, peaceful, and successful for Israel. We will be back with you Monday morning, 10 a.m. Eastern Time, 5 p.m. here in Israel for our next briefing. Until then, stay safe, stay strong. Take care, everyone.
Thank you very much, and I hope you have a boring briefing on Monday, meaning nothing happens between then.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Take care.